Mayor Curry, thank you so much. Dr. Brunson for having us. And I want to say a special thank you to all of the veterans here. It's such an honor to be here with you and to see you standing when your songs were being played. Kind of sends a little bit of chills for me at that time. And I just want to mention that last weekend I was watching the miniseries Band of Brothers for probably the 5th time, and it was fitting being this time of the month or time of the year to celebrate Veterans Day. So I watched it again, and I probably shed a few tears again. And I do that because it's such a poignant reminder of what those veterans went through and what they sacrificed for us. So I'm always appreciative. I'm not a veteran. I'm just a professional photographer with a love for the history of World War II, a love and appreciation for veterans, and I think there's no better privilege than for a person, a civilian, than to honor the veterans that serve our country. So thank you so much. I had a little bit of inspiration from a photographer I'm acquainted with in England. He started a 1940s project, and he began to photograph British World War II veterans. And I really was captured or captivated by that and enjoyed what he was doing. And I began to think, what can I do and how can I use my talent as a photographer to give back and honor those who are World War II veterans in America? And the only problem was I didn't know any World War II veterans. And this was back in April of this year. Then my wife said, what about Uncle Boogie? That's her uncle down in New Orleans. He's about 97 years old, and he lives in the house that he built himself many, many years ago. And I thought, that's it. He would be perfect to start this project with. And so we reached out to him, called his son-in-law, or his son and daughter-in-law, and asked them what they might think about doing this, photographing him for this project to start off with. And they said no. He's not really comfortable talking about his experiences in World War II. He was a Navy veteran, and everybody in the family knows that he doesn't talk much about it. And I was a little bit disappointed. I thought, I'm turned down right before I even started. But shortly after that, as Al mentioned, I saw Rick Carley's post on Facebook about this 99-year-old Marine Corps veteran, and I saw this picture of him standing in his dress blues in the end zone of Legion Field, and I looked at him and I said, he would be perfect. And how do I get in touch with him? How do I find him? Al told you how that happened, and like he said also, the rest is history. I did get in touch with eventually Colonel Cooper's nephew, J. Danny Cooper, and thankfully he agreed to let me photograph him. You can see his photo I have out in the reception area. There's a big banner that has Colonel Cooper's photo on it. and his portrait. You'll probably see it flashing up here as the images go through. These are all examples of the veterans that I've photographed. And also, if you haven't already, Colonel Cooper is here. He's seated right here on the front row. So thank you for being here. This one contact has led to me now having photographed 67 World War II veterans. I've traveled all over Alabama to Florida to Georgia, Mississippi, and North Carolina so far. The Portraits of Honor story has been featured on local TV news. It has been on national websites. It has even been on the top photography website in Poland, of all places. Poland. That's more than we ever dreamed of when I started this project. But God keeps opening doors of opportunity for me to find other World War II veterans and to reach out to them, to be able to take a portrait of them and give them something back by providing a nice portrait for them and their family to enjoy from now on. And it's amazing because it helps me find more veterans to photograph, and that's the goal of the Portraits of Honor project. So let me tell you about a few of these stories from these veterans that I've met so far. I'll start with Colonel Cooper. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1942 and served a total of 38 years. Among his decorations is the Legion of Merit, one of the highest honors you can receive. After boot camp at Parris Island, some additional training in North Carolina and Virginia, and Camp Pendleton, California, he boarded a ship bound for Guadalcanal. He also fought in the Battle of Okinawa in the Pacific. After Okinawa, his unit moved to Guam to prepare for an invasion of Japan. But 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan forced them to surrender. And fortunately, America didn't have to go forward with a plan to invade the mainland of Japan. Then there's Army Air Corps Staff Sergeant E.W. Bush. He was a nose gunner on B-24, a B-24 bomber with the 15th Air Force, serving in Europe. He's a delightful guy. He's also here, seated about 4 rows back. Thanks for being here. I'm sure I have about a good hour of video of him telling stories about his career. I wish I could show it all here. He told me he has documented 30 missions and 2 additional missions that were never documented before he came home. On one mission, his plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire. A shell went right through the left wing, rupturing the gas tank, but it didn't explode. If it had, he probably wouldn't be here. They did lose fuel, needed to make it back to base, so they had to bail out after managing to cross over Russian lines in Eastern Europe, and they were eventually rescued by Russian troops and made it back safely. John Little is a Hoover resident. He served in the Army with the 34th Infantry Division, C Company, and fought in North Africa and throughout Italy. He was awarded the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart. His unit saw Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, hanging upside down, dead in Milan, killed by his own people. Navy Seabee Dick Paxton is also here on the front row. with his wife, Gloria. I got to be on the local news while photographing him, and that was a lot of fun. We should do that again. I photographed several World War II veterans at the Colonel Howard State Veterans Home in Pell City. It's an amazing place, and some equally amazing veterans who are residents there. They have some fantastic stories to tell, and I think I've photographed 6 or 7 World War II veterans there. One day when I was there, I was greeted by one of those veterans, Bill Massey. I went to introduce myself, and he told me that he was on a B-17 bomber during the war. And that really piqued my curiosity, because when I was a kid growing up and I'd read stories about World War II and those heroes, I loved the B-17 bomber and could not wait to read more and find out more about the people who served on those. So I was excited. Here's somebody who served on one. Then he told me he was a pilot. I was really interested now. And after that, he said, at one point we were shot down. I knew right then this would be a good story. Try to imagine being 22 or 23 years old, and you're the pilot of a bomber with a crew of 10 men flying mission after mission over enemy territory, and the odds of you surviving 25 missions is very low. You're part of a wave of hundreds of other aircraft in the sky flying over the enemy territory, and enemy fighters are zipping in, strafing you every which way you look, or anti-aircraft fire is bursting all around you. Every time you see one of your other bombers fall out of formation and smoking and going down, you wonder if there's going to be any parachutes visible. And many times there were not. Mr. Massey wasn't even supposed to be on his 19th mission, not yet. But another pilot had a little too much to drink the night before, and his crew didn't want to serve with him on this mission. So they asked Massey if he would fly that day. He asked his crew, and they said, why not? You know, the sooner we get our missions completed, the sooner we can go home. So they did fly it. And over France, the flat bursts were so thick, and his plane was hit, causing a fire, and smoke filled the cockpit so that they couldn't even see the controls. So he told his crew, we're going to have to bail out. He proceeded to the nose of the bomber. While close to the exit, the plane exploded, blew Bill Massey out into the air. He had no time to put his parachute on, so here he was falling from 26,000 feet with no parachute. How does that happen? Because when you're a pilot in one of those, the cockpit is so tight that you don't have room to wear a parachute on you. So when he was blown out, he had his parachute packed in his hand. And at 26,000 feet, the air is really cold. It's hard to move, function in any way. But the further he fell, the warmer it got, closer to the earth. And eventually he was able to get at least part of it strapped to his body. And about 3,000 feet, he pulled the ripcord, hoping for the best. And it did open, and he landed in a field in France. Unfortunately, only 2 others of his crew made it out of the plane. For about 6 weeks, they were able to evade the Germans with the help of French farmers until Allied troops came through and they were able to reunite with them. So he's a tough guy. I like pilots. Last Saturday, I attended the memorial service of Earl Miller. Earl was a P-51 fighter pilot during the war in Europe. I photographed him and had lunch with him and got to hear some of his stories, which he freely shared with me about 3 months ago. Once, while in Scotland, he was doing low-level strafing maneuvers just for training, and he would do that over a farm. Well, the farmer who owned that land wasn't too happy, and one time he was flying over and the farmer threw a pitchfork at his plane. It lodged in his wing. And it was still there when he landed back at base. He liked to fly low. One time he came back with mud and wheat chaff in the air intake of his P-51. Earl received the Distinguished Flying Cross as he was flight leader for his group of P-51s. He and 3 other pilots once saw 35 German fighters come along, and the 4 of them took them all on. He remembers the first German fighter he shot down. He chased the fighter into a dive from a high altitude down to ground level and literally between haystacks. Earl said that pilot tried everything. He pulled up into like a chandelle, which is a maneuver where you're flying one way and reverse direction while climbing up. And he said, I riddled that aircraft to pieces. All I could see was that guy with his hands over his face, and then he hit the ground. It was hard on him. As he said, it bothered him for about a week. Once I got over it, I enjoyed the rest of my time, he said. So war isn't pretty. On the 3rd plane Earl shot down, the pilot was climbing out of his fighter, and Earl was still behind it, and he fell back into the prop on Earl's plane. Not an image that's easy to deal with, I'm sure. But yet that was one of the many that he had to deal with the rest of his life. I've photographed also a few D-Day veterans, soldiers who were among the first wave hitting the beaches at Normandy. Soldiers like local veterans Chuck Tompkins and Hillman Prestridge recalled the chaos. As soon as the front landing door on the Higgins boat dropped, going to the beach, heavy German machine gun fire began raking Prestridge's buddies as they stepped off into the water. He was in the first wave. Many died right in front of the boat. So the rest began jumping over the sides of the boat. We had these life preserver things called a Mae West around our waist, he said. They were supposed to float up around our armpits when you filled them with air. But because we were so loaded down with gear, they couldn't do that and just hung around our waist. Lots of men died with their feet sticking out of the water because all the ammo and grenades and backpacks kept them from floating upright. One D-Day veteran I photographed was Ray Lambert. He's an Alabama native, lives in North Carolina now. He was an Army medic in charge of a team of medics. He wrote his memoir called Every Man a Hero just this year at the age of 98. He won numerous medals and saved many men even before D-Day while in North Africa and Sicily. Then on D-Day, he saved dozens of men on the beach, mostly pulling them out of the water. He was wounded at least 3 separate times and was trying to save a soldier caught underwater when the door of a Higgins landing craft opened on top of him, breaking his back. He prayed to God to let him save the man. just kind of man he was. He wasn't thinking about himself. He wanted to save that man that needed the help the most. So as he prayed, the boat then backed off of him, and then he lost consciousness. At the 75th anniversary of D-Day, which was this past June, Ray was there in Normandy, and he was honored and saluted by President Trump and French President Macron, along with many other veterans, several of whom I have also photographed. So I spoke about the miniseries Band of Brothers earlier. My wife and I met and photographed one of the last remaining members of that Band of Brothers from Easy Company of the 101st Airborne. Brad Freeman is 95, lives in Mississippi. He made the jump into Normandy just after midnight on D-Day and fought through France and into the Battle of the Bulge until he was wounded in the leg and sent back to England. He stayed there and recovered, and then went back to his unit shortly before Germany surrendered. Meeting veterans who were at Pearl Harbor has been, when the Japanese attack, has been a treat. I've photographed 3 of them. Frank Emond was in the Navy band and serving on the USS Pennsylvania, which was in dry dock in Pearl Harbor, and he and others were getting ready to raise the colors on board ship when the Japanese planes attacked. He ended up rescuing and transporting injured sailors to medical care. Another veteran I photographed was Thomas Shook, served aboard the USS Phoenix. And he was reading the paper, having some coffee, when he heard explosions, and he looked out the porthole and he could see smoke coming from the USS Arizona. And the red circle on the planes flying by. He knew exactly what was happening at that time. They were able to get their ship safely out of the harbor. But it was a somber and quiet night, that first night at sea. Not many people were talking. Another veteran I photographed recently was Edgar Harrell, here in Vestavia Hills. He was visiting, giving us a breakfast recently and a breakfast speech. He was a Marine serving on the USS Indianapolis. Many of you may have heard about the USS Indianapolis. It had just finished delivering some components of the atomic bomb to Tinian Island in the Pacific. On its way back, a Japanese submarine sank it, and of 1,196 crew members, only 317 survived 5 days floating in the ocean, plagued by sharks and dehydration and hypothermia. There are at least 60 other stories I don't have time to get into today. I wish I could. I'm so glad to honor every one of these brave men and women. Each one will emphatically say that they are no hero, that they were only doing their job as they were taught to do. And the real heroes are those who didn't make it back. They gave everything. Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of John 15:13 in the Bible, which reads, "Greater love has no man than this, than to lay down his life for his friends." There's a haunting quote from near the end of the Band of Brothers film that says, "I wonder if people back home would ever know what it cost the soldiers to win this war. How could anyone ever know the price paid by soldiers in terror, agony, and bloodshed if they'd never been to places like Normandy, Bastogne, or Hagenau, or Guadalcanal, or Iwo Jima?" And another quote from the book Never to Return, which was written about the sinking of the USS Leopold in the icy North Atlantic. It was a destroyer escort that my uncle, Huey Bracknell, served on and died on. Sometimes it's good to view events not through the lens of time, but through the perspective of those there in the moment. From that perspective, you can better understand those who were there and know something, some measure of what they were feeling. Standing here, I feel much more. I also feel a sense of gratitude for the sacrifices that have been made back then and even now. So where does the Portraits of Honor project go from here? Maybe more national exposure. Maybe I'll do a tour cross country to photograph more veterans and be able to share more stories like this. I do know of one particular veteran who lives in New Orleans that I'll be photographing next week. Remember Uncle Bookie? He has finally agreed to let me photograph him, and I look forward to doing that. Thank you for coming.